Jennifer Rourke.
Mr Speaker, New Zealand First will support this bill, even though it makes only a very few improvements in the face of a situation which cries out for much, much more improvement than we see here. But even a little is worth something, so let's hope that more will come in the future. Mr Speaker, on reading Shamabeel Yaqub's book Generation Rent earlier this year, I was impressed by the differences it described between New Zealand's rental market and legislation and those of other countries with much better developed rental markets and much better legislation. And there were at least three differences that were pointed out, and one was fair rents. And it's obvious that New Zealand does not actually have a fair rents regime at all when you compare it to what you see in other countries. And secondly, New Zealand doesn't have secure tenancies in comparison to what you see in other countries. New Zealand's tenancies tend to be short-term and tenants have very little protection against eviction. Thirdly, there is this question of quality of rentals, which this bill does something but not enough to address. Mr Speaker, there are far too many old dumps being let in New Zealand to people who can't afford to buy their own homes and who have to rely on the rental market. That's the truth of the situation. So this bill makes a couple of very minor improvements which are welcome but not nearly enough. So much more needs to be done, and it needs to be done in all three of those areas which I mentioned. So the message I want to give to the government is this. Many people are now finding that that home ownership is utterly out of reach for them, and that's a result of the lacklustre performance of this government over 7 years as far as housing is concerned. Just about everybody knows and acknowledges that. And the result is that many, many more people now have to accept that they will never own a home of their own, and they will need to rely on what is actually an inadequate rental market. Too few rental properties to rent, and too few of them in anything like adequate condition. So the government needs to move firstly on regulating rentals, especially where landlords have been profiteering, and those situations are, for example, especially those in Auckland because of the housing crisis there, and also Christchurch because of the effects of the earthquake there. In both those situations, the market failed, rents exploded, people were hurt, and the government did nothing. The second area in which it has to move is security of tenures. It is too easy to get rid of tenants in this country so that they don't have another home to go to. And more long-term tenancies are going to be needed because people won't be able to afford to buy their own home. The government needs to do a lot more to encourage that, but again, nothing is being done. And thirdly, Mr Speaker, the bill needs to move much more to improve the quality of rental properties so that people have a genuine alternative to owning their own home. And we're not seeing that. We're not seeing improvements on heating standards. We're not seeing improvements as far as leak proofing is concerned. We're not even seeing improvements as far as minimum standards for earthquake resistance, size of accommodation, and the list goes on and on. Not nearly is being done in any of those areas. Not nearly enough is being done in any of those areas. And most of all, Mr Speaker, the number of quality rentals available is far too little, and this government's response to that seems to be, let's sell thousands of state houses. That's a good idea. Or let's shove off responsibility for social housing to community organisations. That's a good idea. None of that is a good idea. What is a good idea is that this government needs to invest much more in social housing in New Zealand, and I've listened to some of the figures being bandied about by the Minister and others. It's still not nearly enough because the problem is huge and it needs a much greater response from the government. Mr Speaker, this bill does do a couple of good things. It does require smoke alarms and insulation. Great. and the cost-benefit ratio of that is excellent. Great. And there will be few deaths per year resulting from fires. Great. And it also improves enforcement powers to regulate on the technical needs for smoke alarms and insulation. It empowers the Chief Executive to take cases itself direct to the Tenancy Tribunal for persistent breaches of the legislation. It empowers the Chief Executive to authorise a search where needed to get evidence of a breach, and it empowers the Chief Executive to require landlords to provide relevant information. All those are good steps forward, but they are very minor compared to the size of the problem. The bill also streamlines the processes for the recovery of possession by a landlord where there has been a tenancy which has been abandoned. Great. All those things, again, good but not enough. So, Mr Speaker, overall New Zealand First does support the bill, but we simply say this. We say that a whole lot more is needed if this country is going to provide homes for people, A, by making them more affordable, which is not what this bill is about, but B, by creating a tenancy market which provides a genuine, good quality alternative for people who will never be able to afford their own home. We in New Zealand First do not think that a warrant of fitness approach is the right way to go. We think that's got some problems, but we do think that there's a lot more that can be done in all three of those areas which I've already mentioned. Regulating rentals will make a big difference to ensure that there are better ways as to how rentals should be fixed, to ensure that rentals are fair so that people can afford them with or without government assistance. And secondly, security of tenures also needs attention. The government simply doesn't seem to have thought about that at all. And in fact, that's a very important issue. What New Zealand does need is a situation where people, as an option, choose long-term tenancies. Tenancies in which they can feel secure, homes in which they feel are permanent for them, even though they are renting them or leasing them. That's a situation that you see in other countries, especially Germany and other European countries, and in the United States, where there is a huge dependence on that end of the market. But in New Zealand, we are not seeing enough of that because the legislative and regulatory regime doesn't support it. So the government should move on that. And this bill only moves on the quality of tenancies, and only in two very tiny ways. Good ways, but not nearly enough. And the result is that there are far too many substandard tenancies in New Zealand, as I've said, old dumps that people are letting instead of a quality service. And those people tend to be amateur landlords just buying a house to let as a way to improve their retirement prospects. But that's not good enough. We need to encourage professional letters of long-term rental properties so that we get a better option for people who will depend on it. And, Mr Speaker, there are countries overseas with much more sophisticated rental markets, much better legislation, which this government could take notice of and do a whole lot more than it is to ensure a better quality rental market for people who will need that in the future. So finally, Mr Speaker, while supporting this bill, we say, great, we'll vote for it, but we do want to see a whole lot more done by this government, and it hasn't done much over 7 years, let's face it. They need to do a whole lot more in the future to improve New Zealand's housing market, and especially the housing market in this country. And what it's doing to date is actually retrograde and is not improving anything at all. So let's see a bigger effort by National. Let's see some really good ideas. Let them have a look at what happens overseas, borrow some ideas, and do a lot more than we're seeing in this bill.
Todd Miller.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and it's great